They said a black man's voice was for singing spirituals in the background, a comforting sound of sorrow that white audiences could appreciate from a safe distance. They said his place was on the stage, not in the halls of power, in the theater, not on the picket line. They said he should be grateful for the fame and fortune America had allowed him to possess. In the 1940s, Paul Robeson was arguably the most famous and beloved black man on planet Earth. He was a titan, a world-class athlete, a brilliant scholar, a movie star, and a singer whose bass voice was so powerful, so profound, that it was described not as a sound, but as a force of nature. He had it all: wealth, adoration, and access to the highest echelons of society. He had dined with presidents and performed for kings. Yet, this man, who stood at the absolute pinnacle of success, would make a choice so dangerous, so defiant, that it would bring the full, terrifying power of the United States government down upon him. He would choose to sacrifice everything: his career, his fortune, his passport, his very name, not for more fame, but for his principles. He would stand before the most powerful men in America, men who could destroy him with the stroke of a pen, and he would not bend. He would not apologize. He would, instead, put them on trial. This is the story of the man they could not break, the voice they could not silence, and the war one man waged against an empire, armed with nothing but the truth. To understand the giant they tried to fell, you must first understand the mountain he stood upon. Paul Robeson was not born into a world that expected him to succeed. He was born in Princeton, New Jersey, in 1898, the son of a runaway slave who had become a preacher. His very existence was an act of defiance. In an era of crushing segregation and systemic violence, his father taught him a lesson that would become the bedrock of his life. Your mind is the one place they can never enslave you. Young Paul took this to heart. He was not just bright, he was incandescent. He arrived at Rutgers University as one of only a handful of black students and proceeded to dominate every field he entered. He was a debating champion. He achieved the highest academic honors. And on the football field, he was a god. Imagine the scene: a young black man in the early 1900s, on a predominantly white college football team. He was subjected to brutal, targeted violence. In his first varsity scrimmage, his own teammates tried to break him. They dislocated his shoulder, broke his hand, and tore his fingernails off. He was carried off the field, a bloody mess. The coach told him he probably did not have what it takes. A week later, Robeson returned. When the same players charged him again, he met them with such controlled, explosive power that he left 3 of them unconscious on the field. The violence against him stopped. He had earned their respect not by complaining, but by demonstrating a power they could not match. He became an All-American, considered by many to be the greatest football player of his generation. But football was just a stepping stone. He went on to Columbia Law School, financing his education by playing professional football on the weekends. He was a lawyer, a professional athlete, a scholar. He was the living embodiment of the talented 10th that W.E.B. Du Bois had written about, proof that excellence could shatter the ceiling of racial prejudice. But even as a lawyer at a prestigious New York firm, that ceiling proved to be made of concrete. When a white secretary refused to take dictation from him because of his race, Robeson realized that even in the halls of justice, his intellect would always be secondary to his skin color. He walked out of that law office and never looked back. The world of law was too small for him. He was destined for a bigger stage. His wife, Eslander, a brilliant and ambitious woman in her own right, convinced him that his true power lay in his artistic talents. His voice, that impossibly deep and resonant bass, was a gift. He began singing the spirituals he had learned in his father's church, and the world was mesmerized. When Paul Robeson sang, it was as if the entire history of black sorrow and resilience was channeled through one man. He moved to London, and his fame exploded. He became an international superstar. His concerts sold out across Europe. He starred in plays, and his portrayal of Shakespeare's Othello in London in 1930 was a landmark event. A black man, playing a tragic hero, not a caricature, was a revolutionary act. He became a movie star, one of the first black actors to achieve leading man status. He was rich. He was celebrated. He was, by all accounts, a success. He had proven that a black man could, in fact, conquer the world. But as he traveled that world, he began to see that his personal success was a beautiful, glittering cage, and outside that cage, his people were still in chains. And that was a contradiction he could no longer live with. The voice that had brought him fame was about to be used for a very different purpose. The glittering cage of his success was London. In the 1930s, London was the capital of a global empire, and it treated Paul Robeson like royalty. He was the toast of the city, a celebrated artist who moved in the highest circles of society. He debated with playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and social theorists like H.G. Wells. He was living a life that was unimaginable for a black man back in the United States. He could enter any hotel, dine in any restaurant, and be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the power of his talent. But it was here, in the very heart of the British Empire, that the seeds of his revolution were planted. He began to meet other black men, not from America, but from Africa, students, intellectuals, and future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. Listening to their stories, Robeson began to see the world through a new lens. He realized that the humiliation of a black man in Mississippi was not an isolated incident. It was connected, by a dark and invisible thread, to the subjugation of a Kenyan farmer by a British colonial officer and the exploitation of a Congolese miner by a Belgian corporation. For the first time, he saw the struggle of his people not as a domestic American problem, but as part of a global war against colonialism and white supremacy. He devoured books on African history, on anthropology, on political theory. He was no longer just an artist. He was becoming a scholar of oppression. He began to understand that the system that had put him in his glittering cage was the same system that had put the rest of the world in chains. And he started to look for the key. He believed he found it in 1934, on his first trip to the Soviet Union. He arrived in Moscow filled with a lifetime of conditioned fear. He was a black man from America, a country where the simple act of looking a white person in the eye could get you killed. He expected the same cold stares, the same subtle reminders of his place. What he found was a thunderbolt of revelation. He walked the streets of Moscow, and for the first time in his life, he felt not like a black man, but simply like a man. People did not stare at him with suspicion. They pointed with excitement, recognizing the famous American artist. He was invited into people's homes, offered bread and salt, treated not just as an equal, but as an honored guest. He would later say, "Here, for the first time in my life, I walk in full human dignity." If there are still real American patriots out there, speak up. United States, drop your state and city below. Let's see where the heart of this country still beats strong for a man who had been subjected to the constant, grinding poison of American racism. This experience was transformative. The Soviet Union, at least officially, preached a doctrine of racial equality. For Robeson, this was not an abstract theory. It was a reality he could see and feel. He saw ethnic minorities from across the Soviet Empire treated with respect. He saw a society that, on the surface, seemed to have erased the color line that had defined his entire existence. The experience was so profound, so liberating, that he would later send his only son, Paul Jr., to be educated in Moscow, believing he would be safer from the psychological damage of racism there than in any school in America. He did not see the gulags or the terror of Stalin-esque purges that were simmering beneath the surface. What he saw was a nation that offered him something America never had, the simple, profound gift of being treated like a human being. This awakening was not confined to Moscow. His conscience began to pull him toward every major struggle for human dignity on the planet. When fascist forces led by Francisco Franco attempted to overthrow the democratically elected government in Spain, Robeson saw the battle lines clearly. He saw fascism as just another name for the same violent supremacy he knew from home. He did not just send money. He went to the front lines. He stood in the trenches with the international brigades, men from all over the world who had come to fight fascism, and he sang for them. Imagine the scene. In the midst of a brutal war, under the threat of artillery fire, that magnificent bass voice rising over the battlefields of Spain, singing songs of freedom and solidarity. He was using his voice not to entertain, but to fortify the human spirit in the face of tyranny. He found another front in his war in the coal mining valleys of Wales. He had gone there to film a movie, but what he found was a kinship that transcended race. He saw the Welsh miners, white men, trapped in a brutal cycle of poverty and exploitation, their bodies broken by the mines, their communities starved by the greed of distant owners. He saw in their struggle the same desperation and the same dignity he knew from the sharecroppers of the American South. He marched with them on their hunger strikes. He sang at their union halls to raise money for their families. He declared, These people are my people. His fight was no longer just about race. It was about the fundamental right of all human beings to live with dignity, free from oppression, whether that oppression came from a slave owner, a colonial master, or a corporate boss. With every trip abroad, the contrast with his home country became more painful, more infuriating. While he was being celebrated as a hero of the people in Spain and Wales, black men in America were still being lynched. While he could walk freely through the streets of Moscow, his people could not drink from a whites-only water fountain in Alabama. The world had shown him what was possible. America was showing him what still was. The glittering cage of his fame was no longer just a cage. It was a prison of hypocrisy. He could no longer stand on a stage in Carnegie Hall, singing spirituals of sorrow for the entertainment of a wealthy white audience, and pretend that this was enough. He made a vow. His art could no longer be separate from his politics. His voice, the gift that had brought him fame, would now become a sword. He would no longer simply sing about crossing the River Jordan to a promised land in the afterlife. He would demand that promised land here and now, on earth, for his people. He had been an artist who was an activist. Now, he would be an activist who was an artist. America had created a global superstar. Now, that superstar was turning his gaze back home, and he was coming back a revolutionary. The voice that America loved was about to say things America was not ready to hear. When Paul Robeson returned to the United States on the eve of World War II, he was a changed man, and he was returning to a nation on the brink of profound change itself. America was gearing up to fight a war against fascism, a war for democracy and freedom. And for a moment, it seemed as though the country's ideals and Robeson's newfound purpose were aligned. The government needed a powerful, unifying voice to rally support for the war, and there was no voice more powerful than his. He became an icon of American patriotism. His rendition of Ballad for Americans, a sweeping, populist anthem celebrating the nation's diversity, became a national sensation, played constantly on the radio. He toured the country, singing for troops and factory workers, his presence a symbol of a united America. He was, once again, the nation's beloved superstar. But Robeson's support for the war was conditional and clear. He saw it as a peopleless war, a global fight against the very idea of a master race. And he made a dangerous assumption. He believed that a nation fighting against Nazi racial ideology abroad could not possibly maintain a system of racial apartheid at home. He believed that the hypocrisy would become so glaring, so indefensible, that Jim Crow would have to crumble. He demanded that the government desegregate the armed forces. He insisted that black workers be given equal access to jobs in the booming defense industries. He used his immense platform not just to support the war, but to hold the nation's feet to the fire, constantly reminding America of the glaring contradiction at the heart of its own crusade. And for a time, it seemed to be working. President Roosevelt, under pressure, issued an executive order banning discrimination in the defense industry. The doors were beginning to creak open. But as soon as the war ended, the cold, hard reality snapped back into place. The fight against fascism was over, but the fight against racism at home had just begun. And the very forces that had celebrated Robeson as a patriot during the war now began to see him as a threat. America was entering a new conflict, the Cold War. And the world was being divided into two camps, the free world led by the United States, and the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. There was no room for nuance, no space for dissent. You were either with America, or you were against it. This was the trap that had been set for Paul Robeson. His deep admiration for the Soviet Union, his belief that it represented a genuine alternative to American racism, now became his greatest liability. He had seen the Soviet model as a tool for liberation. The American government now saw it as a mortal enemy. His continued praise for the USSR, combined with his increasingly militant demands for civil rights at home, made him a target. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, his activism was no longer seen as a fight for justice. It was recast as subversion, as treason. The turning point came in 1949. At a peace conference in Paris, Robeson gave a speech in which he was quoted as saying it was unthinkable that black Americans would go to war against the Soviet Union, the one nation that had treated them with full human dignity. The quote was taken out of context, sensationalized, and blasted across every newspaper in America. The backlash was instantaneous and cataclysmic. Paul Robeson, the beloved patriot, was now Paul Robeson, the traitor. The press, the politicians, the public, the very forces that had built him into an icon, now turned on him with a terrifying, unified fury. This was the moment the system had been waiting for. They could not attack him for demanding an end to lynching. They could not attack him for insisting on the right to vote. But they could attack him for being a communist sympathizer. It was the perfect weapon. The House UN American Activities Committee, HUAC, a powerful and feared congressional body tasked with rooting out communist influence, summoned him to testify. This was not a trial in a court of law. It was a show trial, a public inquisition designed not to find the truth, but to destroy reputations. Witnesses were bullied, careers were ruined, and the charge of communism was used to silence anyone who challenged the status quo. Everyone expected Robeson to do what so many others had done before him, to plead the Fifth Amendment, to refuse to answer questions on the grounds of self-incrimination. It was the safe, legalistic path. But Paul Robeson had not come to be safe. He had not come to hide behind legal technicalities. He had come to fight. In June of 1956, he walked into the hearing room in Washington, D.C., not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor. He was not there to answer for his beliefs. He was there to put the committee, and the entire system it represented, on trial. The room was packed, the tension electric. The congressmen on the committee, confident and smug, began their interrogation. They asked him the question they asked everyone: are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? Robeson looked at them, his gaze unflinching, his famous voice not booming, but calm and dangerously precise. He refused to answer, but not on the grounds of the Fifth Amendment. He told them that the question itself was illegitimate, that in a free country, a man's political affiliations were his own business. Then, he went on the attack. He began to lecture them on the principles of democracy. He told them that they were the ones who were UN American, that their persecution of dissent was a betrayal of the very constitution they claimed to uphold. The committee chairman, his face turning red with fury, tried to cut him off. He demanded that Robeson answer the question. Robeson leaned into the microphone. "You are the UN Americans," he declared, his voice finally rising, filled with the righteous anger he had held back for so long, "and you ought to be ashamed of yourselves." The room erupted. The congressmen were stunned into silence. No one had ever spoken to them like this. Robeson then turned the questioning back on them. A congressman from the South asked him why, if he loved the Soviet Union so much, he did not just move there. Robeson's response was a masterstroke of defiant genius. He looked the congressman dead in the eye and said, "Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country, and I am going to stay here and have a part of it just like you. And no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?" The congressman had no answer. Robeson had not just defended himself, he had claimed his birthright. He had declared that America was his country, not by the permission of the men in that room, but by the right of blood, sacrifice, and belonging. It was one of the most powerful and courageous moments of political theater in American history. A single, unarmed black man had faced down the full power of the state and had not given an inch. He walked out of that hearing room having won the moral victory. But the system he had defied was about to make him pay a terrible price. The moral victory inside the hearing room was electrifying, a moment of pure, uncut defiance that would be whispered about in activist circles for generations. But outside that room, in the cold, unforgiving world of Cold War America, the war against Paul Robeson was just beginning. The system, having failed to break him in public, now set out to destroy him in private. The goal was no longer just to silence him. It was to erase him. To turn a global icon into a non-person. The weapon they used was not a prison cell, but a kind of invisible cage, designed to slowly suffocate his career, his spirit, and his connection to the world. Immediately following his testimony, the State Department took an unprecedented step. They revoked his passport. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a devastating blow, a calculated act of political cruelty. For an international artist like Robeson, whose career was built on performing for audiences around the world, a passport was like oxygen. Without it, he was trapped. He could no longer tour Europe, where he was still beloved. He could no longer travel to the Soviet Union or the emerging nations of Africa and Asia, where he was seen as a hero. He was confined to the very country that was persecuting him, a prisoner within his own national borders. The cage tightened. The machinery of the blacklist, which had been so effective in destroying the careers of Hollywood screenwriters and actors, was turned on Robeson with a vengeance. His records were pulled from radio playlists. His films were removed from television schedules. Concert halls that had once begged for the honor of hosting him now cancelled his bookings, citing security concerns or community pressure. The FBI actively worked behind the scenes, visiting venue owners and record executives, advising them that booking Paul Robeson would be an unpatriotic act, a signal of communist sympathies. It was a shadow campaign of intimidation, and it was devastatingly effective. The economic impact was catastrophic. A man whose income was once measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, millions in today's money, saw his earnings plummet to just a few thousand. He was forced to sell his home, to rely on the support of a small circle of loyal friends. The system was starving him out, attempting to prove that defiance had a price, and that price was poverty. But the financial loss was secondary to the artistic one. A voice like his was meant to be heard by the world, to fill the grandest concert halls. Now, it was largely confined to small church basements, union meetings, and the occasional outdoor rally that had not been shut down by local authorities. Perhaps the most insidious part of this erasure was the campaign to write him out of history in real time. He had been an All-American football player. Now, his name was removed from the official record books of college football. He had sold millions of records. Now, his recordings gathered dust, unplayed and unmentioned. He had been a symbol of American patriotism during World War II. Now, his contributions were conveniently forgotten. It was a systematic effort to create a world in which Paul Robeson had never existed. For a man whose entire life had been a testament to the power of being seen, this enforced invisibility was a form of psychological torture. But they had underestimated the man. Paul Robeson refused to be broken, and he refused to be silent. If he could not perform in Carnegie Hall, he would perform on the back of a flatbed truck. In 1949, he was scheduled to give an outdoor concert in Peekskill, New York. Before the concert could even begin, the event was attacked by a mob of local vigilantes, stirred up by anti-communist hysteria. They brutally beat concertgoers with baseball bats and rocks while state troopers stood by and did nothing. Robeson himself was shielded by a human wall of union members and veterans who had come to protect him. The concert was cancelled. Any other person would have seen this as a final, bloody warning. But Paul Robeson was not any other person. He announced that he would return to Peekskill a week later to give the concert. It was an act of pure, unadulterated courage. He was declaring that he would not be intimidated by mob violence. He returned, and this time, thousands of supporters formed a protective ring around the concert grounds. He stood on that stage, in the face of death threats and a seething mob held back just beyond the perimeter, and he sang. His voice, that magnificent, defiant bass, rolled over the hills of Peekskill, a sound of unbreakable strength. But after the concert, the mob, aided by law enforcement, ambushed the departing concertgoers. They smashed car windows with rocks, dragged people from their vehicles, and beat them mercilessly. The Peekskill riots became a national scandal, a horrifying display of the violent fascism that Robeson had been warning about, now unleashed not in Spain, but in the suburbs of New York. For 8 long years, from 1950 to 1958, he remained a prisoner in America. While the world moved on, he was trapped, unable to travel, his voice largely silenced. The strain took a heavy toll on his health, both physical and mental. He suffered from bouts of severe depression. The constant pressure, the feeling of being hunted and isolated, began to wear down even his titanic strength. He was a giant, but he was still a man. And yet, even in his cage, he found ways to fight back. He wrote a book, Here I Stand, a powerful manifesto that laid out his political beliefs and his unwavering commitment to the fight for freedom. It was a declaration that, even if they had taken his stage, they could not take his mind. And he found a new, ingenious way to reach the world. In 1957, he gave a concert to an audience in London, not by travelling there, but via a transatlantic telephone cable. His voice, transmitted under the ocean, filled a London concert hall, a ghostly, defiant act of technological resistance. The world could still hear him. The cage was not soundproof. The fight to regain his passport became a global cause célèbre. Artists, intellectuals, and political leaders from around the world signed petitions and wrote letters demanding that the U.S. government let Robeson travel. The hypocrisy was becoming an international embarrassment for a nation that claimed to be the leader of the free world. Finally, in 1958, after a landmark Supreme Court ruling in a separate case affirmed that the right to travel was a fundamental liberty, the State Department relented. His passport was returned. After 8 years, the cage was finally unlocked. Paul Robeson was free to go. But the man who emerged was not the same one who had entered. The years of persecution had left deep and lasting scars. The return of his passport in 1958 should have been a moment of triumphant vindication. Paul Robeson, the unbreakable titan, had outlasted his persecutors. The cage was open, and the world was waiting to hear his voice once more. He immediately embarked on a world tour, a return to the stages where he had once been king. And for a brief, glorious period, it seemed as though the legend had returned. He performed to sold-out crowds in London, sang Othello in Stratford-upon-Avon, and was greeted with thunderous, tearful ovations wherever he went. In the Soviet Union, he was welcomed as a conquering hero, a symbol of resistance against American imperialism. For a moment, the old magic was back. The voice was still there, perhaps a little weathered, but still capable of shaking the very foundations of a concert hall, still able to bring an audience to a state of reverent silence. But the man was not the same. The 8 years of relentless pressure, of isolation, of being treated as an enemy in his own country, had taken a toll that no amount of applause could erase. Those close to him saw the change. The easy, confident laughter was rarer. His eyes, once so full of defiant fire, now held a deep and profound weariness. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, a warrior who had been fighting on too many fronts for too long. The long years of persecution had not just damaged his career, they had damaged his health. He suffered from high blood pressure, and the bouts of depression that had begun during his confinement grew more severe. He was a giant, but he had been wounded, and the wounds were deep. The final, tragic chapter of his public life began in Moscow in 1961. While attending a party at his hotel, he experienced what was described as a severe psychological breakdown. The details are murky and have been the subject of intense debate and conspiracy theories ever since. He was hospitalized, and the official diagnosis was severe depression and paranoia. Some of his supporters, including his son, Paul Jr., would later argue that this was no ordinary breakdown. They pointed to the constant surveillance he was under from American intelligence agencies. They raised the possibility that he had been targeted, perhaps with psychoactive drugs, by the CIA, who saw him as a powerful and dangerous symbol, even in his weakened state. We may never know the full truth of what happened in that Moscow hotel room. But what is certain is that Paul Robeson, the man of unbreakable will, had finally reached his breaking point. He spent the next several years in and out of hospitals and clinics in London and East Germany, undergoing treatment, including electroshock therapy, that may have done more harm than good. The fire that had burned so brightly was now a flicker. In 1963, physically and mentally shattered, he returned to the United States for good. But he did not return to the public stage. He returned to a life of quiet, deliberate seclusion. The world's most famous black man simply vanished. His timing was cruelly ironic. He returned to an America that was finally catching up to the very ideas he had been persecuted for. The civil rights movement, which he had helped to inspire, was now in full swing. Young activists were marching, protesting, and demanding the very rights he had been fighting for decades earlier. The songs of freedom he had sung were now the anthems of a new generation. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the student leaders of SNCC, they were all, in their own ways, his ideological children, carrying forward the struggle he had been forced to abandon. He was their spiritual godfather, yet he was absent from the fight. He would meet with some of the movement's leaders privately, offering quiet encouragement, but he never again stood on a public platform. His health was too fragile, the risks too great. The man who had been the loudest voice for freedom was now condemned to silence, a spectator to the revolution he had helped to create. The final years of his life were spent in Philadelphia, living in his sister's home, a ghost of his former self. He read, he listened to music, he received a few close friends, but the public man was gone. The world that had once celebrated him, and then tried to erase him, now simply forgot him. A new generation grew up knowing of King and Malcolm, but the name Paul Robeson was a fading echo, a footnote in a history that had already moved on. He died on January 23, 1976, at the age of 77. His death made the news, of course, but the obituaries were often muted, uncertain of how to tell the story of this complicated, controversial giant. Was he a hero or a traitor? A civil rights pioneer or a communist dupe? The nation still did not know how to answer. But the battle for his legacy was just beginning. In the years after his death, a slow, determined effort began to reclaim his story from the distortions of the Cold War. Scholars began to write new biographies, re-examining his life not through the paranoid lens of anti-communism, but through the lens of the black freedom struggle. Activists and artists who had been inspired by him began to speak out, to tell the story of the man they had known. His recordings were re-released. His films were shown at revival houses. His name was gradually, painstakingly, brought back from the margins of history. This was not an easy process. The charge that he was an apologist for Stalinist crimes is a serious and complex one. He, like many idealists of his generation, saw the Soviet Union's stated commitment to racial equality and was perhaps too willing to overlook the brutal realities of its totalitarian regime. He was not a perfect man. He was a flawed, complex human being who made choices that, in retrospect, can be questioned. But to focus solely on his political misjudgments is to fall into the very trap his enemies set for him. It is to use his politics as an excuse to dismiss his profound and courageous fight against American racism. He was a man who saw the hypocrisy at the heart of America and had the courage to call it by its name, at a time when doing so meant risking everything. He understood, long before it was fashionable, that the struggle for black liberation in America was part of a global struggle for human dignity. He used his art as a weapon, his fame as a platform, and his life as a testament to the idea that no person should be judged by the color of their skin. He was a prophet, a man so far ahead of his time that his own country had to break him in order to avoid dealing with the truths he was telling. They succeeded in silencing his voice for a time, but they could not silence the echo. So, we arrive at the end of the story, but at the beginning of the verdict. What is the final measure of Paul Robeson? How do we judge a man whose life was a series of such towering triumphs and such profound, tragic contradictions? To simply say he was a great artist is to miss the point. To simply say he was a controversial political figure is to accept the narrative of his enemies. The truth is that Paul Robeson's life was an earthquake. He was a seismic force that shook the foundations of race, art, and power in the 20th century, and the aftershocks are still being felt today. Let us return to where we began. They said a black man's voice was for soothing white audiences. Robeson used his to thunder against injustice. They said his place was on the stage. He used that stage as a global platform to indict an empire. They said he should be grateful. He responded by demanding not gratitude, but justice. His life was the ultimate act of nepovainovania, defiance. He was a man who was offered a golden key to a gilded cage, and he not only refused to enter, but he dedicated his life to smashing the cage for everyone else. His story teaches us a powerful and uncomfortable lesson about the price of true freedom. For Robeson, freedom was not simply the absence of chains or the ability to achieve personal success. That was the shallow freedom America offered him. True freedom, he believed, was the ability to speak the truth without fear, to fight for the dignity of all people, and to be a whole and unbroken human being, not a fractured version of yourself designed for the comfort of your oppressors. He understood that his personal success was meaningless as long as his people were suffering. And he made the conscious, deliberate choice to sacrifice the shallow freedom for the deeper one. He chose integrity over income. He chose solidarity over stardom. And in doing so, he paid a price that few of us can even comprehend. But he also achieved a level of moral authority that no amount of money could ever buy. The system did not just disagree with Paul Robeson, it feared him. And it is crucial to understand why. They feared him not just because of his sympathy for communism, but because he represented the ultimate threat, a black man who was completely and totally free in his own mind. He was a brilliant, charismatic, globally celebrated figure who could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and who refused to be silent. He was living proof that the psychological chains of racism could be broken. He exposed the lie that black people were content with their lot. He was a symbol of what every black man and woman could be if the shackles of oppression were removed. And that was a vision so powerful, so revolutionary, that the system had to destroy him to prevent it from spreading. The campaign to erase him from history was, in its own way, the ultimate compliment. It was an admission by the most powerful government on earth that they were terrified of what this one man represented. The fact that they had to remove his records from the airwaves, delete his name from the history books, and lock him inside the country for 8 years is a testament to the immense power they believed he wielded. They understood that his voice, whether singing a spiritual or indicting a congressional committee, was a weapon, and they treated it as such. So, How should we remember him? We must remember him in his full, glorious, and difficult complexity. We must remember the artist whose voice could make the world stand still. But we must also remember the warrior who stood before Congress and put them on trial. We must acknowledge his political idealism, even his naivety about the Soviet Union, but see it as part of a desperate, global search for a world free from the poison of racism. He was not a plaster saint. He was a flawed, brilliant, courageous, and ultimately tragic human being who dared to imagine a better world and was broken for it. His legacy is not found in the awards he did not win or the concert halls that eventually closed their doors to him. His legacy lives in the echoes of his defiance. It lives in the civil rights activists who, a decade later, would use his same arguments and sing his same songs. It lives in the anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia that saw him as a brother in their struggle. It lives in every artist today who dares to believe that their art can be a tool for social change. It lives in every person who refuses to be silenced, who chooses to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. Paul Robeson's life asks us a fundamental question. What is the purpose of a voice if not to speak for those who cannot? What is the purpose of strength if not to fight for the weak? And what is the purpose of success if not to demand that same opportunity for all? He was offered a place at the table, but he chose instead to try and flip the table over. He lost that battle in his own lifetime. He was silenced, isolated, and largely forgotten. But history has a long memory. The truth, buried under the rubble of Cold War propaganda, has a way of rising again. Today, we can see him for what he was, a prophet. A man who saw the interconnectedness of global struggles long before it was fashionable. A man who understood that there could be no true American democracy until the nation confronted its original sin of racism. A man who proved that one person's integrity can be more powerful than an empire's armies. They succeeded in breaking his body and his mind. But they never broke his spirit. And they could not erase the truth he represented. The truth that no cage can hold a free mind, and no blacklist can silence a voice that has something important to say. The trial of Paul Robeson is over. History, finally, has rendered its verdict.